Today I'm going to be talking about acid reflux and GERD. So this is a very common problem, and I hope that my video is actually live that whole time. It kind of delays on my end. But nonetheless, we're going to be talking about acid reflux and GERD, which is a very common complaint, both for issues that bring people in to see me in the first place, amongst other things. Often there's other digestive issues, for example, that often go along with GERD. But nonetheless, it's also commonly, it's one of those things that a lot of people think is almost normal. And I know I went down that road way back in college when I was having in high school even, when I was having some health issues, and thought it was normal to just have to take Tums after eating certain things. So today I'm going to shed some light on some of the common underlying mechanisms that might be kind of surprising and enlightening behind acid reflux and GERD. Talk about those common underlying mechanisms, and then we'll talk about solutions where you can start. Okay, so first, let's get really clear, because I am a huge believer that once you understand what normal function looks like, identifying dysfunction becomes much easier, and applying solutions becomes much easier. So let's start by talking about, first of all, what acid reflux and GERD are, and the role of acid in the stomach. We'll kind of briefly go through the digestive process, and then we'll start moving down into what happens when the system breaks down. So acid reflux and GERD are basically the same thing. Acid reflux refers to when acid splashes up out of the stomach through the lower esophageal sphincter, and so it splashes into the esophagus. Now, hydrochloric acid in the stomach has a pH of about 1. So it's extremely acidic. And the stomach is built for that. So it has a really strong mucosal lining to help insulate the stomach so that, obviously the acid's not burning through our own tissue. However, the esophagus doesn't have that. It doesn't have the same protective coating. And so when it splashes up, it very quickly causes inflammation. So some of you might there's different terms for acid reflux. So if something repeats on you, for example, or a little bit of throw up in the throat, or sometimes comes up into the mouth, sometimes just kind of a warming or burning sensation in the lower throat, or sometimes in the chest. People often mistake reflux issues actually for heart issues because it can happen in the chest. Sometimes there can be a pain in the lower, like where the V of the ribs are too. Sometimes a little bit on the left side of the ribs, so the upper left quadrant. All of those can be indicative of acid issues. But when we're talking about true reflux, we're talking about when it splashes up through the lower esophageal sphincter into the esophagus. GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease, like I said, basically the same thing, but that's when acid reflux is chronic. And especially if through an endoscopy, a doctor is able to see that there's inflammation in the esophagus, showing that it's been a chronic issue. And so that's where GERD comes from. So now let's talk about what the role of acid is. Because a lot of people think, oh yeah, it's for digestion, which is true, but I think it'll be helpful when I outline the secondary role of acid as well. So first, let's kind of briefly walk through what normal digestion looks like in the stomach. So ideally, when you sit down to eat, you're in a calm, relaxed state of mind. You're hungry, you're smelling the food maybe as it's being cooked. And all of that accounts for basically just the anticipation of eating, which is the first. So digestion actually begins in the brain. A lot of people, if I ask the question, where does digestion start, they would answer in the mouth, or some would even answer in the stomach. But it actually starts in the brain. And this is really important because 20% of digestion is the cephalic phase of digestion, which means just anticipating food, being hungry, being present with the meal, smelling the food as it's cooking. All of that process starts the digestive juices. So we start releasing saliva, we start releasing hydrochloric acid in the stomach, and we start releasing bile and pancreatic enzymes from the pancreas and gallbladder. So it kind of primes the digestive tract. Then when we go to sit down, we actually eat. take a bite of food, thoroughly chew the food, ideally with saliva. That mixes it with different enzymes as well. Swallow, hits the stomach. Now the food hits the stomach. We refer to this as a bolus, and when it hits the stomach, we start to refer to it as chyme. And nonetheless, so the stomach begins the mechanical, which is the physical breakdown, so it's physically churning the food, and chemical, which is the chemical breakdown of food. So acid reflux, proteolytic enzymes that help with breaking down protein, starts mixing with the food. Depending on what you ate, food sticks in the stomach for anywhere from 20 minutes up to 2 hours. If you had like an apple versus if you had a steak. So the length of time it's going to stay in there varies depending on what you had to eat. But nonetheless, chemical, mechanical digestion of food. Then it passes on to the first part of the small intestines, which is called the duodenum. And the acidity from that hydrochloric acid mixed with the food that we now call chyme, that acidity triggers a reflex. And that reflex is now the gallbladder and more importantly the pancreas. Pancreas releases bicarbonate, which helps neutralize the food acid mixture, as well as other enzymes. So more proteases, amylases, lipases, different enzymes to help break down different types of food that are activated at a more alkaline state. So pancreas releases bicarbonate to neutralize the acid, enzymes to break it down, gallbladder releases bile, and from that point forward, it goes into the small intestines and it continues to be broken down into smaller and smaller subparticles until the rest is, absorbed and eliminated. So the other thing I want to point out is a couple of things. One is there's two different sphincters that are involved with this. I'm not going to get too biology on you, but it's important to know that there's two different sphincters. And a sphincter is basically a one-way valve, right? So it represents something that can only go in, it can't go back. So there's the lower esophageal sphincter where the esophagus connects to the stomach. That ensures that food only goes down into the stomach and doesn't come back up. You can think of a sphincter also like a really tight rubber band, right? You want it to stay closed. Closed unless it's relaxed and more open to allow food in, but then it immediately closes back up. So there's the lower esophageal sphincter. And then there's the pyloric valve. So the pyloric sphincter, which goes from the stomach to the duodenum. So the first part of the small intestines. And the integrity of those sphincters matters. And the other part of this is both of those, just like a lot of things in the body, work on a reflex loop. So the lower esophageal sphincter is responding to, many different things, gut-brain connection, many different things, but it's important to mention that it's responding to acid level, like pH levels in the stomach. So as pH levels drop with the release of acid, that's one feedback loop to close for the lower esophageal sphincter to close. Okay, so that's one. The second is that same reflex I was talking about before, where when food is passing down in the first part of the small intestines, pancreas releases bicarbonate. That acidity touching the duodenum is another part of that reflex loop. Okay, so that's important to keep in mind. Now, that highlights the role of hydrochloric acid in digestion. And the last thing I want to mention with that too is certain nutrients require the presence of acid. They require a certain pH in order to be absorbed. And we're talking major nutrients. So zinc, magnesium, calcium, iron, B12, B vitamins, but especially B12, all of those, and even protein, and then protein digestion from a macro perspective require hydrochloric acid to be absorbed. So this is one of the big reasons why we saw, couple years ago, this landmark study came out showing that chronic antacid use leads to dementia. And the connection between that is because it causes low B12 levels. And so especially if that goes on for years, and of course that's going to affect brain health. Okay, so that kind of gives you an idea. So we talked about the role of hydrochloric acid in digestion. The one other part that I want to mention with this, because it'll connect to our underlying causes, is hydrochloric acid is also kind of part of the immune system. And what I mean by that is it's part of a protective barrier system. So one of the categories of immune function are barrier systems. So physical barriers that we have that keep the internal body safe and divided from the external body. So some of these other barrier systems that will resonate or be more familiar with you are the skin barrier, the lung barrier, the gut barrier. Blood-brain barrier is a little bit different, but kind of gives you an idea, right? Physical barrier. So how does that work? Basically, the food represents the closest that the outside world is going to come in contact with our inside world. And so because of that, if we're going to be invaded by a pathogen, there's a really good chance, there's a high likelihood it's going to be from what we're eating. So hydrochloric acid is also that protective mechanism, because if we eat a bad bug, let's pray it's killed in a vat of acid before it's passed on to the rest of the digestive tract. Okay, so I mentioned that too because when we talk about those underlying causes, more acid release could actually be a protective mechanism, or what the body is perceiving it needs to protect itself from. Okay, so now let's get into some of the underlying causes of acid reflux. There's two categories that I'm going to talk about. One is truly too much acid. So when we think of hydrochloric reflux, most people think, and oftentimes most people are told, oh, it's an excess of acid. Your stomach's producing too much acid. You need to take an antacid, which then helps neutralize it, depending on what kind. So Tums helps neutralize it. Something like Pepsid or omeprazole actually they interfere with your stomach's production of acid, right? So one issue is too much acid. Second issue is too little acid. And there are some differentiating features that you can recognize with this independent of testing, so different symptoms. So for example, too much acid, it can happen, sometimes you'll feel reflux on an empty stomach. Sometimes you feel burning when eating certain foods. Sometimes just burning in general, like kind of a burning pain in between the ribs. Sometimes, well, there can also be other features like health features that go along with too much acid. But nonetheless, the other thing I want to mention too is with too little acid, we see things like excessive belching. We'll see prolonged sensations of fullness. So you eat a small amount of food and you just feel like you're full for hours. Bloating, upper GI tract bloating is quite common. Sometimes gallbladder issues, pancreatic issues. So the symptoms, but at the end of the day, what most of people probably recognize is I just have reflux, and that's the biggest thing that sticks out. So let's talk about too little acid first, then we'll talk about too much. So having too little acid in the stomach can lead to acid reflux. How does that work? Acid is, so again, part of this goes back to the cephalic phase of digestion and not being present with the meal, which then leads to low acid at the start of a meal. But first, I want to mention just the most basic part of how this works. So if you remember, I said the lower esophageal sphincter that divides the esophagus from the stomach acts on a reflex. When the pH of the stomach changes, as the stomach releases acid, the pH of the stomach changes, and that's a trigger for the lower esophageal reflux sphincter to close. If we don't have sufficient hydrochloric acid in our stomach at the start of a meal, that reflex never happens. So when we eat, the sphincter stays open because there's not sufficient acid in there. So we eat, then the expansion of the stomach triggers the brain, a reflex with the brain, a neurological connection to the brain, to then release acid, but we're only operating at 80%, right? Because remember, cephalic digestion accounts for at least 20% of digestion. So we're only operating at 80%. And then secondly, the acid is kind of conceptually released on top of the food, if that makes sense. I mean, it's still coming from the stomach, but nonetheless, there's already food in the stomach when the acid is being released rather than the food hitting a vat of acid. and it's being released as the stomach is already churning. So all of this, plus the lack of that reflex, allows the lower esophageal sphincter to stay open. And then as the mechanical digestion of food occurs, that reflex comes back up and we experience reflux. So what causes low hydrochloric acid? A few different things. A big one being stress. Stress is a really big one because stress downregulates all aspects of digestion. You can think of it this way. Probably heard this analogy before, but if you're running from a lion, which is what the sympathetic nervous system represents, right? Fight or flight. So if you're running from a lion, your body doesn't really care what it had to eat that day. It's going to immediately shunt its metabolic resources towards anything that will help you escape the lion. So heart rate, breathing, respiration, the leg muscles, the arm muscles, anything that will help you escape the immediate threat. The problem with this is we're running from lions all day long. And so when that's a chronic issue, now we are down regulating digestion chronically, and that starts to be a problem. So stress is a big one. The other part of stress is not being present with a meal. So how many of us are guilty of eating while working, eating while driving, eating while feeding the rest of the family, eating while doing a bunch of stuff, and we're not actually focused on eating? And so that, even though we might not necessarily feel stressed per se, we still aren't activating that 20% of digestion. So we're automatically operating at only 80% capacity. And that's if everything else is working right. So when we get to solutions, I'll talk about that, how to overcome that or support your body in that process. So stress is a really big one. Bacterial overgrowths. So specifically, one of the most common causes is Helicobacter pylori. Helicobacter pylori is a stomach bacterium that lives in the submucosal lining of the stomach. It's supposed to be there. It's what we call commensal, meaning all of us have it. It's normal, but it becomes a problem when it's allowed to overgrow. And when it overgrows, then it actually interferes with our these kind of COX-2 pathways in the stomach that allow for sufficient healing and repair of the mucosal lining. It interferes with that. And it interferes with our ability to produce acid. And so not only does it lead to low hydrochloric acid, it can also be associated, depending on the virulence of the H. pylori, it can also be associated with stomach ulcers because now we can't effectively repair the mucosal lining. So acid starts to touch it and then it gets through and we get ulcers. So ulcers, gastritis, stomach inflammation, stomach cancer, it can be a nasty bug. Not to mention symptoms, right? So a lot of people that have H. pylori experience chronic reflux, like stomach pain, excessive belching, bloating, things along those lines. So H. pylori is a big one. I also want to mention briefly SIBO, so small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. These two things actually go hand in hand. So low hydrochloric acid is one of the more prominent factors that can actually lead to small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. But then the inflammation associated with SIBO and then sometimes the maldigestion that it causes can aggravate acid reflux also. So kind of a double-edged sword there. I can go into other infections like Epstein-Barr virus, even other viruses can lead to acid reflux, but I'm not going to go down that line. So for right now, we'll just look at low hydrochloric acid, stress or lack of presence with the meal being a big one. Second being H. pylori and or bacterial overgrowths. Third being nutrient deficiencies. So you have to have certain nutrients in order to manufacture hydrochloric acid. Iron, zinc, a lot of the same ones that you need in order to even absorb these nutrients. So they kind of go hand in hand. But nutrient deficiencies can also lead to low hydrochloric acid from a lack of ability to produce it. And last thing I'm going to mention, but I'm not going to go on this too much, but it is relevant, especially for anybody that's experienced either whiplash or traumatic brain injury, TBI. The gut-brain connection is also really important. So the vagus nerve specifically, which mediates the parasympathetic nervous system, which is our rest and digest side of the nervous system, innervates the stomach. And so that's turned off with stress, but it can also be inhibited or decreased with injury. So like a brain injury or whiplash, where because it runs through the neck area. So whiplash, where it might damage the spinal cord in the neck. So that can also lead to persistent reflux, most commonly amongst other digestive issues too. So those would be the three, I guess, four main factors that can contribute to low hydrochloric acid, which is honestly the most common cause that we see of of reflux is low hydrochloric acid. So what that means too is taking Tums, taking omeprazole, they can actually make things worse. They'll aggravate the dysbiosis, they'll aggravate the nutrient deficiencies, they'll aggravate the maldigestion. So that case, it can, like I said, often make things worse. So that's where testing can be invaluable at knowing, is it actually too low or is it high? There's a home test that you can do. So I use stool testing to actually thoroughly evaluate if there's too low or adequate hydrochloric acid. But there's also a home test that you can do where you mix in baking soda into water on an empty stomach, drink it, time it 5 minutes. If you don't belch within 5 minutes, if you do belch within 5 minutes, it indicates low hydrochloric acid. If you don't belch within 5 minutes, it indicates sufficient hydrochloric acid. If you Google baking soda hydrochloric acid test, the recipe and everything will come up. But just know that that's a good starting point to give you kind of an idea. Okay, so that's low hydrochloric acid. Next is high, just actually having too much acid. And again, there's different things that can cause this too, but one of the most common issues that I see with truly too much acid boils down to that immune response. Specifically, I'll see this with allergies. So interestingly, histamine, there's different types of histamine receptors. There's 3 different types of histamine receptors. But nonetheless, there's a connection between histamine activation, so immune activation, the allergic response, and the release of hydrochloric acid, especially if what you're eating is a sensitive food or allergy. Then the body perceives it as a threat, and one protective response that it will have is to make more acid. Remember, if we're going to be invaded, let's hope it's killed in a vat of acid before it's passed down to the rest of the digestive tract. So it's intelligent for the body to make more acid in the presence of a perceived threat. So this is where I'll see reflux come in with, to start off simple, something like a food allergy. The symptom of a food allergy or a food sensitivity can be perpetual reflux, especially like gluten, dairy, corn, soy, these different foods that highly allergenic, top 8 allergens, something we're eating all the time. And so it can lead to feeling reflux all the time. So food allergy or sensitivity is a big one. And then also, we start to get into more like chronic infections. So gut dysbiosis, viral infections, mold, toxic mold, I'll see this with, sometimes Lyme, like these other stealth infections. That's a whole other conversation. And to be perfectly honest, I rarely start there, right? We don't always have to be that aggressive. But if someone, they're presenting with chronic reflux, we run a stool test or do the home test, figure out which one it is. I'll usually start with an anti-inflammatory diet and some digestive enzymes, and sometimes I'll go into some helpful supplements in just a minute, but helpful supplements to help with that. For a lot of people, that clears it up. For a small percentage of people, it doesn't though. And so that's where we'll look into other things. So for example, having a cholecystectomy, gallbladder removal, that can interfere with the integrity of the sphincter, that pyloric sphincter, and allow for sometimes bile reflux to come. Bile splashes back into the stomach, which then splashes up because it's very alkaline. So it splashes back up the lower esophageal sphincter, and it feels like acid reflux, but it's not. It's actually bile reflux. So that could be something different. Pancreatic issues can cause this issue too. But nonetheless, like I said, kind of start at the most surface level with what's most common: stress, being present with the meal, relaxed eating, sufficient nutrients, any kind of, address like H. pylori, which is really common, digestive support through enzymes, etc. You know what I mean? Start there. And then if it doesn't go away, then you continue to dig deeper and deeper until you figure out what's causing it for each individual person. So nonetheless, to kind of wrap up the conversation of too much acid, like I said, truly excessive amounts of acid, the first thing I think about is protection. What is the body trying to protect from? And we look at food allergies and sensitivities first. And then from there, we can start to look at microbial issues. Starting in the gut, H. pylori, again, can sometimes cause the excess acid in addition to too low. So H. pylori, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, any kind of dysbiosis lower down in the intestines. And then from there, if that layer proves to not provide the answers we're looking for, then we can look at more systemic issues, like either mold or Lyme or stealth infections or surgical complications. Cool. I think that covers it all, kind of the underlying mechanisms. So now I'm going to briefly talk about solutions. So solutions, first and foremost, as you probably gathered from this, figure it out if it's too much or too little. I support the bicarbonate test, so the baking soda test at home to give you an idea. Supplementing with digestive enzymes is a good idea regardless. So that will often help. If it's too low, that will often help. Especially if you drink apple cider vinegar at the start of a meal and notice improvements in digestion, that can help or give you an indication. Versus if you drink apple cider vinegar and you either like immediately throw it up or it splashes back up really badly and you notice more adverse effects, then that can also give you an answer that it's too much acid. But nonetheless, starting with a digestive enzyme can be really helpful. There's different brands that I recommend, but you can find at least a basic one to get you started over the counter. Second, and I emphasize this a lot, is being very present with the meal. Eating in a calm, relaxed state and being present with the meal. So how I walk clients through this, sit down at the meal, ground yourself, take 3 deep, slow breaths, and I encourage you to bring the food up to your nose to smell it and really pick out the scents. And what we're looking for is you want to wait until you start to salivate. When you feel yourself salivate, you're calm, maybe bless the meal, then begin to eat, okay? Then you're in the right state of mind or in the right state of nervous system. So, excuse me, I've got something caught in my throat, speaking of. So nonetheless, first step, calm, relaxed state of mind, be present with the meal. Second, consider a digestive enzyme that you take with each meal at the start of the meal. You can also consider apple cider vinegar. So just a swig, like a tablespoon, a swig of apple cider vinegar. You can put it in a very small amount of warm water. Again, at the start of the meal, which will help lower the pH, stimulate the release of hydrochloric acid. Third, a couple of other helpful supplements. One is deglycerized licorice, and another is aloe. Both of those things help calm and support the mucosal lining of the stomach. Last is zinc carnosine. And zinc carnosine, actually, because you need zinc to manufacture acid, zinc carnosine helps heal the mucosal lining. It aids in production of acid. So zinc carnosine can do a lot. It also supports the immune response. It's one of my favorite products for acid issues. So those 3 supplements in addition to the enzymes that you could try. And then third is an anti-inflammatory diet. So I would start with dairy. If you're going to start with anything, I would start with dairy. Cut out all dairy. I don't care what kind of animal it's from, cow, sheep, yak, goat, anything. Any kind of milk derivative. So milk, cheese, ice cream, butter, anything. Give it at least 3 weeks and see how your reflux responds. Next recommendation would be gluten, and then corn and soy. You can also do food sensitivity testing, which I highly recommend. I've got other videos on that, but nonetheless, all of those are kind of the 4 starters, and then sugar and like processed food. Those are the 4 starters I would start with and see if that helps, and then especially aid in that digestion. And then from there, if it still persists, then we can look into some deeper kind of underlying mechanisms that might be based, more unique to you specifically. Okay, everyone, I think that covers everything, and hope this was helpful, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks so much. Bye.